Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. In 1989, the National Infertility and Family Building Association launched an initiative with the stated goal to empower you and change the conversation around infertility. The annual campaign, now known as National Infertility Awareness Week, is aimed at educating the public, reducing the stigma of infertility. This should give Catholics pause. The Church does not see IVF as a morally licit means of becoming a parent, and so we have to have a serious conversation about this. Joining me to have this conversation is Leigh Snead. She is a writer, editor, speaker, and mother of four, also a fellow for the Catholic Association, and she lives in Indiana with her husband and 4 sons. Leigh, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, my pleasure. How are you, Marcus?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to reconnect with you.
Yeah, terrific. I was so happy when, you wanted me on.
So, tell us about the genesis of this week. I know I touched on it briefly, but also how, even in its best intention, it's lacking in a proper biblical worldview for treating infertility.
Yeah, its primary focus seems to be, if you look at any of the of their sort of promotional materials, is to basically any financial or sort of regulated thing that keeps people from accessing IVF is sort of what the whole fight is again. They want, companies, private companies, they want insurance, they want everything to cover this. And that would even go for somebody, now they're really pushing to expand the idea of what infertility means and who is infertile, so that like a single person could be considered infertile under their insurance. Even if everything's in working order, but because they don't have someone to procreate with, they would be considered infertile and would be eligible for, whatever IVF benefits they're seeking for everyone else. So that's not exactly championing any issues that would be close to a Catholic infertility, and they just sort of bypasses everything we believe about, marriage, sexuality, procreation. Life is a gift. A child isn't a commodity to be purchased. There's no right to a child. All these things that we believe are completely ignored and, yes, not even acknowledged in the commercially mainstream National Infertility Awareness Week.
At the risk of asking you to step beyond your usual realm of commentary, I want to ask your input here. Mm-hmm. How much of a burden will this put on, say, general insurance rates and taxpayer dollars, especially given the moral contentiousness of the procedure?
Well, that really is beyond my expertise. But, I can imagine that it certainly would be a lot. I mean, I think that it really is a big business, infertility, mm-hmm. and people are in it to make money. And so certainly they would prefer it. I mean, the practitioners themselves would prefer that if insurance covered it, because then they would be, financially rewarded for that. And especially if you open up the meaning of what it means to infertile, well, that could even double your customer base. So I'm thinking, yes. And then, of course, with government subsidized insurance, that would obviously go to the taxpayer too. I think there's lots of implications for us beyond just, just our sort of moral repugnance that went on. There's definitely a sort of a civic element to that as well.
Why, when it comes to conversations of infertility, have Western conversations spiraled into the IVF solution as if it's the panacea?
I think that it's easy for anyone, really, just in the sort of modern Western culture we find ourselves in, very science-y culture, thinking that somehow, like, if the more sort of tubes and tools and medicines and things that we use, the more sort of a guaranteed type of treatment it is. I think also that the reports, it's an unregulated industry, IVF. We don't really know exactly what's going on, although reports do say that because techniques apparently are getting better, that the creation of excess embryos is diminishing in something. So that's obviously a good thing, but still, it's still horrific. The number that are in cryo storage right now, I think it's over 1 million. I think people are gravitating towards more control too. People want children, their own biological stuff, but even in the case of donor gametes, they want people, and I'm sorry, I'm all over the place with this because there's just so much to talk about. You look at companies like, say, Orchid, who had some features, I think, in both the Washington Post and the New York Times about a year ago, and they are marketing embryo screening services, and not even to people with infertility. It's all about doing what's best for your future child, which, like, they're not talking about, but they're sort of just destroying all the ones who don't make this, whatever arbitrary cuts you're making in the choice of your child. And so I think people are really leaning into that consumer idea that I get a child when I want one, no matter what my age, no matter what my marital status, no matter this is something I can do. And not only do I have the right to pay for it myself, but someone else should actually pay for it for me because this is my right. And so I think that's why we turn to IVF. I think people don't like to wait. People want instant gratification. People want, people want control. We all want control. And, but as Catholics, we do try to turn over that control to God and realize that that's where, our lives really should be centered. But I think that as a whole, Western people like to say when and if and how and all that.
Can you help share with our listeners? Undoubtedly, many of them have a concept of this, but share with our listeners the tremendous moral evils associated with the IVF procedure and why this conversation is so important.
Yeah, well, I think people don't realize it because you think, oh, these sad people want a baby and I want to help them, I want to support that, and this seems to help them get the baby they desire. So beyond sort of, we just talked about the commodification of children and, choosing for different traits, et cetera. There is a removal of, like a divorce of the marital act from procreation. So the unitive and the procreative, which are very important, right, to our Catholic theology and our understanding of what marriage is, those two things are separated. And so you're actually sort of almost inviting, strangers into the bedroom for this most intimate thing where you're supposed to, like, welcome the gift of life. Instead, you're sort of forcing it with doctors and whoever else, technicians and all kinds of things. There's the destruction of embryos that don't make the cut. There's also just, if you do create extra embryos, they can be donated, they can be just destroyed, or they can be left permanently in cryostorage. And then there's this, question later on, what do you do with them? And there's different solutions, and some people do end up, sort of having some sort of breakthrough, spiritually, intellectually, something, and they sort of understand once they've got, children, say from like the first few rounds, they bring home live children from IVF, and then they realize that those little embryos in the freezer are also their children, not potential children, could be human beings, but they are, just as they're, living children at their house are, once were little embryos. That's what these are too. But for many, they just think, again, that sort of idea of family size, governed by not, your choice, by somebody else, God. I think that people will be like, well, I'm done building my family. Now what do I do with these embryos? So you have that problem. And then you have, you have people who then get divorced or unpartnered, and then they're treated as, like actual property, and, some want to keep them, some don't want to keep them. There can be mix-ups and heartaches, and those are sort of the like underlying sub-issues. But it's just a big mess when you take, human conception out of the bedroom and into the laboratory.
We're talking with Leigh Snead, writer, editor, speaker, mother of four. We're talking about, National Infertility Awareness Week and why IVF isn't the solution. We're running out of time in this segment, Leigh, but I want to open with this further question. Given the sheer moral problems, can you also comment on what IVF can do in terms of harming? We're out of time in this segment, but IVF has detrimental effects on the marriage as well, and it doesn't really have a high success rate. I'm talking with Leigh Snead. She is writer, editor, speaker, mother of four, fellow of the Catholic Association. We are talking about National Infertility Awareness Week and why it's crucial to have this conversation. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Leigh Fitzpatrick Snead, writer, editor, speaker, and mother of four, about the National Infertility and Family Building Association's launching of National Infertility Awareness Week. Leigh, as we were talking about earlier, just before the break, IVF does not have the highest success rate, and we've already talked about the issues of it being touted as the panacea, but tell us about how poor its success rate is.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize what it means. I think that people see people get pregnant with babies, people hear the good stories, but they don't realize that it is, I think it's something like a 40% chance your first cycle, but people often resort to IVF because they're, over 35, their fertility has naturally declined, and the rates for as you get older drop very quickly to the single digit percentage-wise. And also at the same time, it doesn't treat the real pathologies or disease behind the infertility. It doesn't even give a chance. So, you may have some success. You may be able to, get pregnant and welcome a child to your home, but you still have the condition that led to your infertility in the first place. And so I think that promise there that it's some sort of cure for infertility really leaves people sort of high and dry, because it doesn't even. And so then if you do undergo, say, sometimes it really does take 6, 7, 8, 9 cycles of IVF and you're still not pregnant and you're out of money and you're exhausted, physically exhausted, and you still are left with the same, medical problems because no one ever, bothered to look for your underlying causes because they jumped straight to IVF without even, doing some basic tests. That's obviously the opposite of what like a restorative reproductive medicine doctor would do or a NAPRO doctor would do for you.
What kind of effects does all of that have on the marital dynamic and relationship?
Yeah, well, infertile couples really do have quite a high divorce rate, which is it's understandable. I think it's really it gets to the heart of things for you, and especially, if you let that sort of define who you are and maybe change your relationship with your husband or with your wife, I think that's going to, instead of experiencing together, I think that's one of the wonderful things we have as Catholics, our understanding of what marriage is. People talk about when they're experiencing infertility, we're experiencing infertility because it's what it's the marital act. It's what binds you together. The one flesh union. It's you as a couple are infertile. There's no blaming. There's no this and that. I think it's, very obviously all those sort of simple things when you're suffering are very tempting. It's easy to either sort of, wallow in self-pity, thinking that your husband should, go find another fertile wife. I was certainly capable of that in my more delirious infertile moments. But I think that when you let that sort of all just define your marriage, you're reducing the fruitfulness that you're called to, participate in as a married couple to only, biological children, and then you don't realize the gift of self that you are to each other, that your marriage is to the world, to God, to your community, and I think things can start to crumble apart from there. And again, especially when you've taken you've taken the marital act, you've taken that procreative act out of the bedroom, and it becomes less personal and intimate and something, unitive. It ceases to be both, and therefore it just becomes a medical process and, baby making.
You touched on something deeply profound, that even in the cross of infertility, God is still calling the married couple to be fruitful. And so there are more ways than biological procreation to be fruitful. Share with us what that looks like.
Sure. And I think, too, that even, like myself, I'm a mother through adoption, and that's wonderful. And, I'm so blessed by my 4 sons. But again, I think, too, it's not, again, any children, adoptive or biological, are not the only fruits a marriage can produce. You think that, celibate people, priests and, lay celibate, they're also called to be fruitful. People who are, past the point of childbearing and menopause, you don't get to check a fruitful box off because you've already had 6 kids and now you don't have to, make anything of yourself. You're not done being fruitful. We're always called to be fruitful no matter what stage in life we are. But as we enter into a marriage, I think that there's just, there's just so much. I have friends who they talk about their own they infertility, and they were not called to adopt. They talk about what they have is a radical availability. They come from larger families. They have siblings who are quite a bit older than they are. They have elderly parents, and they are able to drop anything at a moment's notice to help care for them, to help with a niece, help with a nephew, help with hospital visits and arrangements. Something that that sort of natural capacity for motherhood and fatherhood that we have is exercised through that care to their family members, not necessarily just, to a parent-child relationship. And I think the same can go for, those couples who are, very dedicated to taking care of the priests in their community, or just people who have more time and more energy for prayer and service. I mean, the list goes on. I think there's just so many ways to be fruitful, but it is hard. You can get really stuck on fruit being children.
You touched earlier on this, on the concept of naprotech. Can you, with some clarity, just help us understand exactly what it does and what it doesn't do?
Sure. It's a system of charting your cycle. Called the Creighton model, developed by Thomas Hilgers at Creighton University. And it's a technique that charts your symptoms over time so that they can detect things. It can be used as a diagnostic tool. It can be used to avoid pregnancy. It can be used to achieve pregnancy. And it's not just a diagnostic tool in terms of, things that could be leading to infertility, like endometriosis or PCOS or some of these more common things that we hear about when we think about an infertility diagnosis. I have a friend actually whose chart, she was actually a NAPRO practitioner, she teaches people the method. And she was teaching a class and realized something about her own chart that showed that there could be a problem, and she actually was able to diagnose her own precancerous cells by charting. And so it's a wonderful holistic way to use the natural biosigns that a woman has in order to take care of her as a whole person. And then there are treatments too that, they're practicing Catholics, IVF's not the table. And so they're really looking for the root causes behind your infertility. They're looking at, the blood work and hormone levels and physical things like, endometriosis. And so there's surgeries and different hormone treatments and, other sort of anti-inflammatory regimens. And, a lot of times because that's, again, you're not shortcutting anything, you're not putting a Band-Aid over anything, you might have to go through several years of that sort of treatment because it's fine-tuning all the time. And so it does take a lot of patience and faith in the process, but really being treated. I mean, I'm 50 years old and I still go to a NAPRO doctor because I really like the kind of holistic care that they provide and the sort of the treatment of you as a human being as well as just the patient.
One of the things we don't often touch on, and I'm very grateful for all that you shared, when we talk about infertility, there is also the percentage of the source of the infertility being the struggle the man has biologically. Mm-hmm. Can you say a word on that, please?
I hadn't given too much thought to it. I mean, I knew a couple stories, but when I wrote my book and I asked some friends who I knew faced infertility to contribute, I had one who I actually didn't realize it was male factor infertility in their marriage. And it really sort of made me think about, because I think I talk about a lot about how women experience it and a lot of, even shame and secrecy and isolation, because it's a kind of, it's almost humiliating to admit that your body's not working like how you believe everyone else is working, and your marriage isn't producing this. Again, just like we always go, there's a fruit, the children, that's not happening for you. But I think that we have these images of virility and strength and things that are really associated with a man's fertility, and I think that leads to people being even more private about that. And so, which means then there's more shame and stuff because you don't hear anyone else talking about it. So I do think, actually, I wish I could remember his name, but I just came across a writer, I think he's in the Protestant tradition, on Substack, and it's not male factor, but he and his wife are experiencing infertility, and he's writing about the whole thing from a man's perspective, and it's beautiful. And I wish I had thought to remember his name, but anyway, he's on Substack. But yeah, I think that that needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be talked about more, because I think that, again, if people are embarrassed and and it's just a diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you're not a good provider and strong man and everything for your family. I think we have these, people project those things, people think of those things, people are worried what other people think of them. That's all these things that are just so private. And that's the thing about infertility, is that you need that community support. You need, to be lifted up and supported, to do things like avoid the temptation of IVF. You need the support of your community. But at the same time, it's all just so private that it's hard to ask for that support. And I think that's especially true probably for men.
Leigh, thank you so very much for joining us to have this conversation. I know we're running out of time. How can people follow your work and find out more? And, of course, your book, Infertile But Fruitful, Finding Fulfillment When You Can't Conceive, will link to the book in our program description today.
Great. My other work is available at LeighFitzpatrickSnead.com. I'm a fellow of the Catholic Association, so CatholicAssociation.org is our website, and you can see some of my recent pieces there as well as the work of my colleagues. And, that's where you can find me.
Well, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate this.
Yep, my pleasure.
My guest has been Leigh Fitzpatrick Snead. She is a writer, editor, speaker, and mother of 4. She's also a fellow for the Catholic Association, and she lives in Indiana with her husband and 4 sons. And she's been talking with us about the cross of infertility, and she's highlighted a tremendous amount, both in terms of when women struggle with the issue, but also when men struggle with the issue. I want to say a word of encouragement to all of you. My bride and I struggled with it for the first 2 years of our marriage. God sees your pain, and so do so many of us in the Covenant family. You're not alone, and we are praying for you, and we join you in solidarity, and know that you have support and encouragement. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.